We are pleased to have him, Dr. Gregory Smithers, author of Native Southerners, Indigenous History from Origins to Removal. Dr. Smithers is a professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University and author of The Cherokee Diaspora, an Indigenous History of Migration, Resettlement, and Identity. His research and writing focuses on the histories of Indigenous people and African Americans from the 18th century to the present. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Smithers.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Scott Scarborough, for having me and arranging this lecture tonight. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate you spending part of your, what is it, Tuesday nights? It's Tuesday, yes. I'm on holiday mode, I'm sorry. First, a land recognition to the original owners of the lands that now comprise Kentucky, acknowledgement of the Shawnee, Cherokee, Yuchi, and Chickasaw people. I'm going to start tonight by talking about the image that's on the cover of my new book. This is a painting by a Choctaw artist. He's now left us. His name was Chief Terry Saul, born in 1921 in Oklahoma. Now cast your mind back for a second to 1920s Oklahoma. This is not an easy place to be indigenous. It's not an easy place to be anything other than Caucasian, quite frankly. And Saul's parents knew that. Like most other Native American families, they knew it was tough to be Indian in Oklahoma. And so when Chief Terry was born, his parents decided that they were going to give him a name that everyone in Oklahoma would remember. Chief. Chief. Those white people were going to call him Chief come what may. Now, Chief Terry Saul was never a chief, but he did grow up to become an artist. He first served in the United States military during the Second World War, and after he came back from his service, he came back to Oklahoma, and he used the GI Bill to go to the University of Oklahoma art school. And there he indulged his interest in things like surrealism and cubism. And the University of Oklahoma at this time was actually a real hotbed of creativity in the creative arts. So Saul picked the right place to be, to try and tell Choctaw and Chickasaw stories using the methods of the surrealist in particular that runs through his work. I recommend checking out his work if you're not familiar with it. If you Google his name when you get home or over the rest of the week, you'll see some really stunning pieces. The reason I like this piece on the screen for the cover of the book is that it's tapping into that sort of combination, that nexus of indigenous storytelling, of the sort of spiritual and material aspect of what it means to be a hunter and a warrior in traditional Chickasaw and Choctaw society. At the same time, he's playing with our sense of time, and space, and place. You see there at the hunter's feet, or at the warrior's feet, this picture is titled Warrior. You see at his feet these what look like, they could be little shafts of fire coming out of the ground, or it could be space and time itself being lifted up off the ground to allow this hunter into a different portal, a different time and space. And that's very important for a couple of reasons, actually. The first reason it's important is because warrior life, hunting life for Native people throughout the Southeast was inherently spiritual. It provided one the opportunity to access a portal into a different dimension. In Native American spirituality, particularly in the Southeast, time and place and space are interconnected. And if you are initiated into the appropriate rituals of your particular tribal group, you can access those portals and those other dimensions. It's important for another reason, too. Actually, it's important for the narrative structure of my talk because it suggests that you can transcend time. You can go back in time, actually. And that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to take you back in time. I'm going to do a little bit of time travel. And in fact, I'm going to take you back to the beginning of everything. I'm going to go big for you tonight. Now, I mentioned interconnectedness. Native people in the Southeast did believe that the different dimensions of time and space were interconnected. They were separate but interconnected. They balanced each other. Balance and harmony is an important concept to keep in mind when we're thinking about Native cultures. In the Southeast in particular, but throughout much of the Americas, and particularly North America. In the Southeast, everything is water. In this universe, on this earth, everything is water in the beginning. And there are a number of different origin stories that Native people tell, particularly in the Southeast, which I outline in more detail in the book, that help us understand how we got from this watery portal, this watery space that once was planet Earth, to the mountains, the Piedmonts, the ocean coastline. How did we get to all of this? And there are several different stories that Native people tell to get us to the point that we're at by the time Europeans arrive in the 16th century on a permanent basis. One story that is common throughout the Southeast suggests that a water beetle dove down into the deepest parts of this watery earth and pulled out a fistful of mud. And that fistful of mud constituted the first beginnings of this earth. They ultimately become the Appalachian Mountains. Other stories, Cherokee tell this story in particular, tell a story of the earth being suspended on four cords that approximate the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. Also, up and down are also directions in Native South cosmology. And those cardinal points, where the earth was lifted from the bottom of the watery earth that was at the beginning of everything, they constitute the mountain ranges, Appalachian, and what used to be known as the Mexican Mountains or the Rocky Mountains. And in fact, the Rocky Mountains feature in the origin stories of many native southern tribes, including the Muskogean-speaking people who come to be known as the Creek Indians. They refer to the Rocky Mountains as the backbone of the universe. And I can talk more about these origin stories as we move through our discussions today. The image that you see on the screen here is reflective of how Native people in the Southeast tried to embed their sense of originality in the landscape. Throughout the Native South, prior to European invasion and settlement, or exploration and settlement, what we see are Native people throughout the Southeast and the Ohio River Valley remaking the earth and the landscape to approximate their sense of spiritual belief in cosmology and to approximate the social structures that they're beginning to develop throughout the 2 millennia before Europeans arrive. The image on the screen is of Nanawea. Nanawea is a sacred site located today in Winston County, Mississippi, but it's sacred to both the Choctaw and Chickasaw people, but in particular the Choctaw. The Choctaws tell a number of stories about Nanawea. One of those stories is that from a portal in the ground, the original Choctaw people, the ancestors, came out of the ground, and to commemorate that origin point, the Choctaw ultimately built this ceremonial mound upon which their council house, their most important council house, sat prior to European arrival. There are other explanations for why Nanawea was built. One of those stories is of the famous leaning pole. So the story goes something like this. The ancestors set out on an epic journey somewhere west of the Mississippi. And they followed the direction that this pole, this sacred pole, pointed them in. And they would walk throughout the day, and then at the end of the day, when the pole was erect, they knew it was time to stop. They bivouacked, they prepared food, they told stories, they went to bed. They got up the next morning, and whichever direction that pole was pointing, they knew that that was the direction that they had to travel to get to their homeland. And this continued for days until one morning the ancestors woke up and that pole was not pointing anywhere. It was pointing perfectly straight. And it was at that point that the Choctaw people, in their telling of this story, knew that they were home. And it is on that spot, the legend goes, that the Choctaws' ancestors constructed Nunawea. Importantly, they weren't the first to construct mounds and mound complexes throughout the Southeast. The image on the screen that you see is a reproduction of an archaeological site that we know today as Poverty Point. It's located in Louisiana. Poverty Point was at its peak around 800 before the Common Era, or 800 before Christ, as we used to say. This was a society that was dynamic and diverse. It was a society that had agriculture. It was a society that had scientists, engineers. It was a society with healers. It was a society with teachers, parents. And yes, sad to say, like every civilized society, it had its bureaucrats. All of this is very important because this suggests to us from a very, very early period in the history of the American South, human civilization had been organizing themselves around principles of permanence, of agriculture and trade, and with that came stories. And it is the storytelling aspect of the Native South that I'm most interested in the book that I've written and in some of the tales that I want to share with you this afternoon or this evening. Poverty Point is fascinated archaeologists for a long time. It's a society in which archaeologists have uncovered evidence of art and culture. It's a society, as I said, that suggests a diverse economy. The types of items that have been uncovered from the Poverty Point site suggest trade with tribal groups in what is today Mexico and around the regions, the borderland region between the United States and Canada throughout the Great Lakes. Right, we talk about globalization and international trade as something that is fairly recent in our collective history. In actuality, Native peoples throughout the Americas have been doing it for an awful long time. Once Europeans hop on Turtle Island, it's really a new phase of that globalized international trade that we would recognize today. Poverty Point is what we historians and anthropologists and archaeologists refer to as a chiefdom society. And the map on the screen maps out some of the major archaeological sites where, with the help of oral traditions and with written documents from both Native and European people from the 1500s and 1600s forward into the present, we've been able to construct something of what it looked like, what life looked like in those early centuries. Now, the chiefdom societies that I want to just talk a little bit about this evening, they were at their peak. I mean, if Poverty Point's one of the sort of models on which the societies you see on the map there, modeled themselves on around 800 BCE, well, we're talking then another century or so as these people from this region of the Gulf Coast fan out across the native South and recreate new kinship networks to foster chiefdom societies of various complexity, and I can talk about the different levels of complexity during Q&A if you like, between the years 700 in the Common Era and about 1600. Right? And that 1600 date, I'd suggest fix that in your head for a second, because that is the century in which European engagement with native people throughout the Southeast and indeed throughout the Ohio and Illinois valleys really begins to accelerate. Not only disease, but warfare, interracial mixing and intermarriages, a whole panoply of factors come to impact life by the 17th century for native Southerners, and that's important. I'm going to sort of get there eventually. But these mound societies were quite special. They're quite spectacular. You have one here. I don't know if anyone has been to the Wycliffe Mounds. Some of you have? Yeah. If you haven't, I recommend a drive down there. It's really beautiful country. The Mounds Society that I want to talk to you briefly about now is known as Moundsville. It's located about an hour or so south of Tuscaloosa in Alabama. And it's really quite an extraordinary society that native people built here. When you drive into this enormous bowl-shaped amphitheater that the various mounds, there's about 29 or so mounds that are constructed in what is ostensibly a city-state that native people built on the Black Warrior River. And I know when I first visited there, my breath was taken away. I did not expect to see the sort of architectural grandeur of this society still sitting here in the middle of nowhere, Alabama. And indeed, what we've learned over the past 20 or 30 years is many of the mound complexes that native people constructed throughout the native South are as large, if not larger, than the pyramids of Egypt. So we're genuinely talking here about monumental architecture pre-European contact in those years between 700 and 1600. Moundville was beginning to really take shape around the year 1000. By about 1100 in the Common Era, it was really humming. This was what we refer to, we anthropologists and historians, as a paramount chiefdom. It was a very complex society with an elite class of leaders who were connected to the great spirits, bureaucrats beneath them and healers, and the rest of us at the bottom, doing the work, doing the agricultural work, doing the trading, doing the caring of children and the elderly, doing all the basic function and work that keeps a society running and meaningful. We were creating the art, too, those of us at the bottom. So this is a society then between 1100 and roughly 1300 that is really very prosperous. It has trade connections with people in what is today upstate New York, through the Great Lakes, down into what is today Mexico, and into Florida also. It's a society that is also engaged in a slave trade, a pre-European contact slave trade that looks a little something like this. Our population, our working age population, for example, may be in need of replenishment in one particular skill set. So the chiefs and the beloved elders, they would get together and make a decision that the warriors are going to head out and engage in a captive raid on a different village. And these could be quite brutal, these could be quite bloody, and they were typically quite terrifying for the village and towns being invaded. Typically, men were killed. And if you like, I can tell you about the blood poll in question and answer. My students always like it when I talk about the blood poll. It's as gruesome as it sounds. Women and children, though, were the preferred captives, and they were brought into a society like Moundville, and they went through all of the initiation ceremonies that this society would put anyone born into Moundville society through. So that in time, those women and children captives would become integrated into the kinship community that was Moundville. In other words, this is not the type of slavery that we became used to, the racialized slavery of the 18th and 19th century that ultimately spilled over into the American Civil War. This is something very different. This is something that's connected to the balance and harmony as Native people understood that concept of their demographic constituency of their population. And it's part of a spiritual worldview as well. And that is something that I talk about in much more detail in the book that I can elaborate on in Q&A if you like. So a complex society, and it's not all noble savages as Europeans would have us believe from the 17th century. These are societies that had wars, that fought. These are, in other words, very human societies. They're complex societies where people held grudges, where people engaged in fistfights, where people cheated on their spouses. The range of emotions and physical human behaviors ran the gamut, is what I'm suggesting to you all. Now, today, we commemorate societies like Moundville, Wycliffe Mounds, other mound-building societies throughout the Native South, as examples of the monumental architecture that Native people built between 700 and about 1600. They're examples, as I mentioned earlier, of social and economic dynamism and of civilizations that constructed and elaborated and renewed their own cultural stories over the centuries. They are all of that, but they're something else. These are societies that, although they look prosperous and permanent on the outside, were actually quite fragile. Native people understood that they needed to continue and continuously work on their relationships with other people, kin and non-kin, and they recognized that those relationships extended not only to other human beings, but to the natural world around them. And sometimes those relationships tended to fall apart, as I've alluded to. And what happened when those relationships began to fray was that some people just decided to move away. They would migrate, and they would either establish their own societies, their new kinship societies, or they would join other societies that looked something like Moundville. Anthropologists and archaeologists refer to this process, as fissuring. And then people, once they fissure off, say Moundville, cycle into another society and become part of that new kinship society. So it's a very flexible system then. And that's important. That's very important to keep in mind, particularly after Europeans begin arriving, and particularly during the 17th century. That century that I mentioned to you all just a few moments ago, because of disease, warfare, intermixing. There's a couple other factors, though, that are important to keep in mind. One of those factors, quite important factor actually, is climate change. The climate changed throughout the Native South and parts of the Ohio River Valley, and indeed parts of the Southwest, what we know today as the Southwest, as a result of changing weather patterns. Actually, there's two big factors that coincide. Changing weather patterns and the arrival of Europeans that led to the sort of demographic disasters that we see throughout much of the Gulf Coast region of the Native South, that left previously worked agricultural lands laying fallow. Carbon output increases. People are left climate refugees, and they're migrating throughout the Native South looking for new homes, looking for new kin to latch onto. And in fact, what we see in parts of the interior Native South, lands that ultimately the Creek and the Cherokee, the eastern Choctaw and Chickasaw, lands that they inhabited, were thought of by Native people in the 17th century as haunted. They were haunted by the ghosts of their ancestors past, and that this was, in actual fact, these were places that one went, particularly at night, at one's own peril. And Europeans comment on this. Europeans comment on the vast swaths of land that are left simply empty throughout the interior southeast during the 17th century. All of these factors, then, are very important in understanding how Native people work to renew their communities and their sense of belonging to kinship communities. It's important to remember that throughout the Native South, the communities and the political societies that we're talking about here are matrilineal. Women have immense political power. It's a system that my wife and daughters think we should bring back into vogue. I tend to agree with them, given what's going on right now. Women controlled food. Women controlled ceremonies like initiation ceremonies. Women had a full voice in the council house. Women were warriors. There was not a role in Native Southern society that women were not part of. Indeed, gender, as we understand it, man and woman, is really not a concept that Native Southerners understood as rational. To give you an example, the Cherokee people had 10 different words for gender. Some of those terms indicate a sense of uniqueness and chosenness. A Sigi, for example, suggests someone who is both strange but special. Now, some of those people today are known as two-spirit people. That's the topic of my next book. But the point here is that this is a society that understood the importance of dynamism and adaptability to ensure that that spiritual and material notion of balance and harmony remained intact at all times. It was something that people were constantly working on in their towns, and women were leading and responsible for guiding that pursuit. We also see this quest for balance and harmony in the relationships that Native people forged with non-kin. What you see on the screen there is the Catawba deerskin map. It's dated from around 1721. There's another map famous from this decade, 1728, that the Chickasaws also constructed and gave to the English. And what you'll note about this map is that it's not meant to be a facsimile. It's not a GPS kind of map that we might use to get, from point A to point B, or from Nashville to Louisville, as was my case today. Instead, this is a map that represents relationships. And what you want on a map like this is you want those, I believe I have a laser pointer, I'm going high tech here. You want these paths to remain open at all times. Native Southerners referred to these paths as the white paths of peace. They were often, for Iroquoian-speaking people, part of something that was known as the covenant chain. Now, this is important. It was represented, the story that they're telling here, this is, at the center of this story are the Nassau, which are the original and core group of the Catawba people, and they're forming relationships with other Native Southerners and the English, who can't really be trusted, so you've got to constantly cultivate them, particularly the Virginia English. And when I tell Virginians, that always goes down well. But in a literate, non-writing society, what you want here is you want to be constantly engaged in dialogue with the people who are connected by these covenant chains or the white paths of peace. Because if those paths are broken, if those chains are severed, chances are you're at war. So if the English, as often happened throughout the 18th century, decided that they were not going to live up to the terms of the last agreement that had been struck, then often what you found were skirmishes and wars that broke out. Similarly, the Cherokees and the Creeks were at war for much of the 18th century because factions within those societies decided that we were not going to abide by the last set of terms that we had agreed to. So this was a very, for colonists and for Europeans in particular, this was a super unstable society. This was a society always on the move, always changing. And understanding the dynamics of that was hugely critical to colonization, if we talk about this for a moment from a European perspective, to not only colonization's aspirations, but to its permanence. Because what we're really talking about here, and this speaks to part of the reason that I wrote this book, is that the Southeast isn't really fully within Anglo hands until the era of removal in the 1820s and 30s. Up until that time, it is very much Indian country. Now, this map that you see here on the screen was produced by one of my mentors, a guy by the name of Jack Forbes. Jack was way ahead of his time. Jack was very eccentric, but way ahead of his time, very insightful. And in the late 1960s and early 1970s, he began to remap North America from an indigenous perspective. And what you see on the map are one of the results of his work. This is a map that represents much of the 18th century. Let's call it the long 18th century. He sort of concludes this map in the 1820s, when the removal era begins. And you'll notice from that map that it's filled in by these lines that are meant to indicate migration, movements, the impact of the slave trade, right? And that one of the things that happens in the 1600s and into the early 1700s is the voracious appetite that the Spanish, the French in the Mississippi Valley, and the English coming in from here and from Virginia have for labor, a tractable labor force. And we see a number of native communities becoming ensnared in a form of transatlantic trade that involves them trading Indian captives to become slaves, not only in the American South, the Mid-Atlantic, and New England, but in the Caribbean as well. In my previous book, The Cherokee Diaspora, I talk about Cherokees who end up in Cuba. That's because of the slave trade. But they hold on to a sense of their Cherokee identity through that experience. So what Jack Forbes was trying to do with the map on the screen then was to remind us that Native people are not static. They're not relics. They're not simply embedded into the landscape, unchanging, mythical creatures. They calculate, they make decisions, they fight, they make some bad decisions at times, and then they reconstitute and renew their understanding of balance and harmony. It's this innovation and adaptive spirit and culture that is the hallmark of what we refer to as coalescent societies that begin to take shape during the late 1600s and into the 18th century. These are societies that center around towns, localized, town-based societies that form the nucleus of what we have come to know as the Cherokee, the Creek, the Shawnee, the Seminole, and so on. And in the short time that I have left before we get to question and answer, I wanted to talk to you about one of those leading figures in this story, in this emergence of town-based political and cultural life during the late 17th century. His name, some of you may recognize him. His name is Tomachichi. By the early 18th century, Tomachichi had seen an awful lot in his life. He lived in what would become Georgia, among the Lower Creek people in that part of the world, among Lower Creek warriors who, around Augusta, Georgia. I love it when the Masters is on every year because it reminds me of the warfare that Creek warriors unleashed on the settlers during the Revolutionary War. I don't think about golf. Tomachichi is part of this world, this very dynamic and sometimes very violent world. Now, he's born in the 1640s, so he's an elder. By the time we get to the first decade and a half of the 18th century, he's very much an elder of a town called Yamacraw. In other words, the Yamacraw Creek form or coalesce under Tomachichi's leadership. Now, there's a lot going on in the Carolinas and what becomes Georgia in the first decade and a half of the 1700s. 1715, a major war that's going to remake the Southeast, breaks out. It's known as the Yamasee War. It technically, according to colonial historians, only lasts about 2.5 years, but in reality, as and other Native historians have argued, it continues in fits and starts for the best part of the next half century. So it's this kind of tumultuous environment that Tomachichi is forced to navigate in the early 18th centuries. Yamacraw Creeks are joined by refugees from Yamasee communities when the Yamasee War breaks out. And I should point out that just a few years before, the Tuscarora War in the Carolinas raged across Tuscarora communities, decimating what was the largest coalescent society of Native Southerners in the Carolinas at the time. Some of the Tuscarora head ultimately to upstate New York and become the 6th member of the Iroquois League. Others become refugees in the Native South and join communities like Tomachichi's Yamacraws. So this is the environment that we're talking about here that he's forced to navigate. Old friends become enemies in this context. Creeks begin to fight against other creeks. Yamacraws have a decision to make. Do they stay with Tomachichi or go? There are two factions that develop. One is led by the man on the screen there, Tomachichi. The other is led by an elder known as Brims of Coweta. And Brims of Coweta is incredibly important to understanding how the Lower Creek ultimately integrated into the Creek Confederacy. Brims makes a decision to try and unite the town-based polities that exist in what is today Georgia under a policy that's known as the Coweta Resolution. And this resolution would do two things. It would provide the towns of the Lower Creek protection under Brim's leadership, and secondly, it would take a foreign policy position of neutrality against the English. That is to say, it would embark on a policy that looked much like the colonists, the European colonists. It would embark on a divide and conquer type policy. That runs absolutely counter to traditional belief and the sense of inclusion that Tamatichi has as the basis for his understanding of both foreign and domestic policy for the Yamacraw. He decides to leave. He decides to head off and ultimately form relationships, foreign and domestic, with both other native Southerners and Europeans. And one of those Europeans happens to be an Englishman by the name of James Oglethorpe. High school civics coming back to some of you? Now, here's where the story sometimes gets a little kooky, right? James Oglethorpe is considered the father of Georgia, and Tamatichi is considered the great friend of one of the fathers of the colony of Georgia, right? James Oglethorpe. You know, much like Pocahontas in Virginia mythology, she's considered the mother of the Commonwealth, and the way Sacagawea is mythologized in relation to Lewis and Clark. Native people become appropriated into stories of national myth-making. The reality is something quite different. So by the 1730s, Georgia, the colony of Georgia, is basically a fait accompli. It's going to come into existence by 1732, according to the Crown. As reward for his friendship, James Oglethorpe says to Tamatichi, "Why don't we have a junket to London? I'll wine and dine you. I'll show you around society, and you can have a great time." Tamatichi agrees, but his understanding of what he's about to do is to engage in diplomacy with the English crown. See, Oglethorpe hasn't recognized that Tamatichi is very much interested in trying to bring the Georgians into his orbit, into his kinship system. He's trying to play Oglethorpe. And one of the best examples of this is what the English describe as Tamatichi's sullen and sort of resistant nature to the talks that go on in 1734 in London, when he says to the king that, "Oh, I need to stop these discussions right now because I've just realized your house is far too big for your needs." He's telling the King of England to downsize. It was probably good advice. Tamatichi returns. Doesn't live much longer once he returns, but he's an example of local town-based leadership that worked very hard throughout the Native South to try and retain town-based sovereignty. Right? And that sovereignty could mean migration and resettlement in the Native South, but what was critical, what was absolutely critical to people like Tamatichi, was incorporating outsiders into that kinship system that was based around town politics, economics, and culture. Now, the book talks much more about what happens throughout the rest of the 18th century and into the 19th century. You'll have to read the book to find out what happens. But what I can say is that there is tension that does develop between people like Tamatichi, leaders like Tamatichi, who are absolutely committed to retaining this localized town-based understanding of kinship and politics, and those who are moving towards something that we might technically refer to as a macro-regional, a sort of larger kind of nation-state type model for groups like the Cherokee and the Creek. Right? And that's going to be the big debate that will consume Native Southerners, really from the 7 Years' War all the way through to the 1820s and 30s, when they have to grapple with removal, when it's in its removal politics, when it's in its full blush. Now, I heard someone earlier talk about Andrew Jackson removing the Cherokees and other Native people. I'll finish on this note, and I can take this up if you like in Q&A in a second. Cherokee are but a small group of between 70 and 100,000 Native American people who are forcibly relocated from their eastern homelands to Indian Territory, or what is today the eastern part of Oklahoma. Between 70 and 100,000. To put that into context, there is between 110 and 115,000 Native Americans living in the eastern half of what becomes the United States. That gives you a sense of the scale and the potential suffering that occurred during several generations of removal politics that Jackson brought to its ultimate, helped to bring to its ultimate conclusion, but certainly did not begin with him. So I'll stop there and open it up for your questions. I appreciate you listening. Thank you.
Okay, if you have a question, please
And I
raise
see
your
a hand down front here.
Bring you the microphone.
Thank you. The Native American Indians, all the way back to Jamestown, has just been something to get rid of.
Mm-hmm.
The great majority of the American population, colonial times, Civil War times, whatever times you want to talk about, they just didn't matter. There was no interest. They were just someone to get rid of. We're going to massacre them. We're going to give them our diseases. Jackson's going to just move them out, march them out. And this is the attitude, the only good Indian's a dead Indian.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the attitude of the majority of the whole country. Explain this attitude.
Yeah, well, what I would say about that is that is part of the story. It's not possible, I mean, if we to go back to Jamestown in Virginia, for example, Powhatan and the members of the Powhatan chieftain could have absolutely crushed the English. They could have decimated them very quickly. They chose not to. And that's because kin-based societies work to try and integrate outsiders into their political economy. That's both a strength and a weakness of their political structures that I've alluded to during this talk, and I talk about in more detail in the book. So that's the first thing I think I would note. The second thing is, yes, there are attitudes of incredible cultural and political chauvinism that run through the European mind or minds when they arrive in the Americas. And this relates to Christianity and the Christian origins of modern racism. One of the reasons that missionaries worked very hard in the 16 and 1700s to try and convert Native Americans was because if you didn't, they couldn't be part of European political societies. In fact, if they refused Christianity in whatever form it came in, then that tended to suggest that Native people were declaring war on your society. So there's that. The third aspect of this is trade and the extraction of natural resources. Europeans could not have done that and established an economic rationale for their patrons and their backers back in England and Europe without befriending and forming alliances with some of the native peoples throughout what is today Canada and the United States. without forging those relationships. It's not to say that they didn't have this sense that they were superior to the native people they were forging relationships with, but they knew that they couldn't simply decimate them. And then there's a final factor, and that is weaponry. The common belief is that Europeans had an advantage because they had arquebuses and muskets, and they were incredibly unreliable, particularly in wet weather. And a really skilled warrior could fire off a number of arrows into one's throat at quite long distances in a very short span of time before the poor old clumsy English redcoat could reload. So yes, I see what you're saying, but it's actually, there's a far more complex and layered story there before we get to the attitudes being brought to fruition with policy and action throughout the various parts of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So I hope that goes part of the way to answering.
I'm always wondered about the names of the different tribes, and so where the origin of the names, was it in their language description of the land, or was it actually names of early leaders?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it's a combination of both, and it's also a combination of native and European words sort of mixing together to form a new word that everyone can sort of understand for diplomatic and economic exchanges. So yeah, language and nomenclature, it does change over time. What we do see is the name of towns often, say, in Iroquoian-speaking peoples. Iroquoian peoples in upstate New York have towns called Seneca, for example. Well, so did the Cherokee in Tennessee. And for fellow Iroquoian-speaking people, that was sort of a marker of some sort of distant kinship that they might have with another Iroquoian-speaking person. So language did travel. Language traveled between groups of the same but sort of different dialects. I talk about that in more detail in my previous book, actually, Cherokee Diaspora, available at all good bookstores.
I had a quick follow-up to the first question,
Yeah.
and then a second question. The first one is, you didn't really say anything about Western utilitarian views of nature as a part of the conflict, and I didn't know if you bought into that theory or not. And then secondly, I'm wondering if your book addresses intermingling between Native Americans and Africans.
Yes. Oh, yeah. You can't ignore that. I mean, that's just written into the master narrative of the Native South after the 17th century. Alan Gallay and many other historians have written extensively about that. But yeah, that's certainly something that I talk about. Yeah. I mean, the whole worldview and this is one of the reasons that we get to that point where people of European ancestry just want to get rid of these Indian people, come what may. And part of the rationale behind that is certainly by the 18th century, and there are seeds of this much earlier, is just the different perspectives that there are on nature and how you view the landscape. So Native people view rivers, forests, as relatives. Right? We can go on with the list. I don't know if some of you saw very recently, a year or two back, in New Zealand, the New Zealand Supreme Court recognized I think it's the Wanganagi River as having all the qualities of a human being. It's constitutionally protected, like any other human being in New Zealand. Native people throughout North America have the same views. So nature is a relative. We're connected to nature. Europeans have a very different perspective. They see rivers and trees and forest and the soil as resources. And that very much does lead to conflicts, and how you use, view, and negotiate over land. In some cases, I can just give you some brief anecdotal examples of this that continue into the late 18th and early 19th century. and they certainly exist earlier too, but there are a lot of Cherokee women, for example, who were very upset with male chiefs who signed away portions of their regional homelands, particularly in the middle towns and overhill towns in what is today Tennessee, because they were very concerned about how the colonists were going to desecrate the landscape and the rivers.
Thank you so much. Going back to that deerskin map, one thing I noticed is that most of the different groups and entities on it are sort of spherical, and then
Yep.
that Virginia section is very angular.
Yeah.
And I don't want to read into it too much, but that would seem to suggest some sort of recognition of a difference in sort of cultural manifestation or outlook. And I was curious if you could say more about that.
That's a really good pickup. Yeah, they were different. Now, the Virginia English had a reputation, and they developed a reputation very, very early in the 17th century. And this was very much in place by the 1640s, when in Virginia they established a system known as the tributary system. So they established basically the first reservation system in what becomes the United States, where tribal groups who agreed to be under the protection of the House of Burgesses would have land set aside for them, and they can live on that land and receive the military protection of the English in Virginia. The English in Virginia broke those promises very quickly and began to break up and dissolve many of the reservations. There's a vast literature on this that I can refer anyone to if you're interested. But yeah, further west and south, Native people were they'd heard the stories. People traveled and told stories about what the English were like, particularly the Virginia English. And they were typically, some of the words that are used are arrogant, untrustworthy. There was a tendency, you can think of William Byrd. I don't know if that name rings a bell to anyone. If you read William Byrd's diaries, you will see a man absolutely obsessed with his own genitalia and what he does with it. He engaged in acts of sexual violence against both African and Native American women throughout Virginia and the Southeast during his lifetime, and indeed many of his descendants did too. So the Virginia English did not have a great reputation, and for that reason, they're constantly on probation. There's a sort of certain degree of keeping them at arm's length and constantly cultivating the relationship, and if necessary, to cultivate the relationship with violence, because violence is a language itself, right? When Native warriors attack backcountry settlers or go to the doorstep of Charleston or Williamsburg and begin attacking communities, they're sending a very clear message to the English that you're not living up to the agreements, the diplomatic and economic friendships that we've agreed to, and so you're now going to pay the consequences of that. So both words and violence are used as a language to remind the English that they're failing in their sort of mutual responsibilities that they have with people who exist within those circles.
Is it true that the mound builders had disappeared by the time Europeans came to this country?
No, that's not true. Many of those societies were still inhabited by native Southerners. Many of them, particularly in parts of the Gulf region, Florida, for example, were still very much living societies that were structured around that sort of hierarchy of complex or paramount chief at the top and bureaucrats, and then us bottom feeders at the bottom of society. But those societies tended not to hold up to the military and political pressures that were beginning to escalate over the course of the 17th century, and add to that the other factors, the demographic impacts of disease, having to adapt to climate change in various parts of the Southeast, climate change that leads to, as I mentioned earlier, climate refugees, that swells populations, that raise questions about how we're going to feed all these people. So coalescent societies seem to be the ones most responsive to those changes. Because for these people, for Native people living in the Southeast in the 17th and 18th century, these changes are happening very fast. And so they needed social and political structures that would respond fast, so that they might sustain some sense of their collective identity. And that ultimately became town-based, sort of smaller. I don't want to say they're like sort of Greek political states, but that's sort of a Native American approximation of that, because there's sort of the input of everyone within the community in the decision-making process going on throughout the Southeast.
Yes, I know that in the first year of his presidency, George Washington established legal territory for the Cherokee Nation, who formulated their own written language and their constitution.
Yep.
And I had wondered how they were able to negotiate that kind of special situation when other Native Americans had not succeeded or attempted. And after hearing you describe, is it Tamachichi and his efforts, I wondered if that laid the groundwork. Is that sort of self-awareness of their community something that led to the special relationship with Washington?
Yeah, great question, actually. And I do talk about this in great detail in the book. And in fact, it's not just the Cherokee, it's the Creek, particularly the Upper Creek. Creek are divided between the Upper and Lower Creek, and that's basically a geographical and linguistic distinction. But there's also the Choctaw and the Chickasaw, smaller groups like the Catawba and the Yuchi. What happens is all of these groups sign treaties. One of the things that we have fixed in our head, like my students come to me thinking, oh, treaties are terrible. They sort of disempowered and took away the sovereignty of Native people. And they ultimately did, I mean, that's the way Anglo-Americans used them, but Native leaders wanted treaties. By the time we get to the 7 Years' War, they recognize that treaties are their written guarantee that the Europeans, particularly the English and later the Americans, will abide by the terms of that agreement. Now, that doesn't happen. And I have a commentary on that, and it may or may not jibe with your commentary, but people like Tamachichi thought that in making that calculation, they were preserving the sovereignty and the cultural identity of their people. Now, this is where we get into, well, was something else needed? Was something bigger, more dynamic, more powerful needed? And that's where these sort of larger, more centralized governments become increasingly an option by the time we get to the American Revolutionary War. Because what the Americans have decided to do during the Revolutionary War and the 1790s is identify certain people as the supreme leaders of particular tribal groups and negotiate just with those leaders. Right, so you've got this sort of uneven tension going on between these sort of American ordained or appointed leaders who will sign treaties with, and women in particular who were very unhappy about this because they were being disempowered by the American Republic's version of colonialism. And they were coming back and they were pushing on these male chiefs saying, what the hell are you doing? So it's a very messy, fraught situation that unfolds during the latter half of the 18th century. Now, I don't want to belabor the point, but Washington engages both in an attempt to engage in treaty making, but he also does something else which he thinks is going to end the, quote, Indian problem in the Ohio and in the native South, and that is try and construct forts throughout Indian country. And these are basically like early modern shopping malls because they provide both military protection, but it's also where people trade. And if you get a fort constructed by the Americans in your regional homeland, then that means the Americans care about you and what you have to offer. Local leaders began to lobby really hard for these forts, not recognizing that what Washington and his administration were trying to do was to integrate them or assimilate Native people into the American economy, and that was the first step to cultural assimilation. And as that's going on, there's more. Thomas Jefferson is writing to the Cherokees and Catawbas telling them, you ought to move west. And then we're talking 1803, 1804, 1806. So very early.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
Mhm.